Hey guys, tonight we're slipping barefoot into the mossy corridors of a Maya temple just before sunrise, where your body is sore from yesterday's bloodletting and your brain is already calculating lunar phases. You are not a warrior, not a king, but something far more indispensable. You're a calendar priest in the late classic Maya world, a glorified timekeeper whose job is to make sure the entire universe doesn't collapse just because you forgot to carry a 1 in the Baktun cycle. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so is every star, planet, and omen you're expected to interpret before breakfast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and the local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes before the sun does, not because you're a morning person, but because the high priest of astronomy screamed through your dreams about miscalculating an eclipse date again. Your bedding is a straw mat on packed earth. Maybe if you're lucky, a textile made from coarse magway fiber. You're lying inside a stone chamber at the temple's base, sweating despite the pre-dawn chill. Because even your sleep is a job as a calendar priest. Your waking thoughts aren't, where's my breakfast? But is it 9 Kion or 7? Chikchan? Today you shuffle toward your small altar space, where incense, obsidian blades, and blood-stained bark paper await. Not the most relaxing nightstand setup, but it's your life. Your first task, light the copal incense, and mentally run through the day's tzolk'in cycle. The 260-day sacred calendar. Miss a number and boom, agricultural chaos, political unrest, or worse, being demoted to assistant frog watcher. The structure you live in hums with ceremonial energy, but has the personal charm of a stone oven. Light trickles in through carved slits. There are no windows, no chairs, and certainly no privacy. You share walls with other priests and their existential crises. Somewhere above you, a king still in bed will soon ask if today's a good day to go to war, or just practice looking intimidating. And here's the kicker. You don't use clocks. You use shadows. You use the stars. You use Venus. Because apparently, that moody planet determines whether your city will win a battle or catch a cold. You consult codices painted on bark paper, flipping delicately through pages as if each one could explode. The glyphs are dense, complex, and every single one has a pronunciation that could give your tongue a cramp. Historians still argue whether priests like you fully understood the astronomical math, or if they were just repeating memorized cycles with the confidence of a modern horoscope writer. Either way, if you mess up, the consequences range from citywide panic to your own heart on a sacrificial altar. No pressure. You haven't even eaten yet. But you've already greeted Itzamna, consulted the day signs, and muttered 3 apologies to Chak the rain god, just in case. Your limbs ache from yesterday's ritual squat holding during a solstice event that ran 2 hours too long because of clouds. Your hands are stained with red pigment. Your mind, a blender of glyphs, gods, and minor anxieties, like did I forget to subtract the way-up days? Some mornings you get a rare moment of awe. A sunbeam aligns perfectly through a temple corridor. A Venus sighting shines exactly where predicted. A hummingbird hovers near your incense cloud and doesn't immediately explode. But most mornings, it's repetition, sweat, and the growing realization that your only job perk is not being a corn farmer. Oh, And one historical fact worth savoring as you brush ash from your stone desk: late classic Maya priests weren't just spiritual figures. They were mathematicians, architects, librarians, and astrologers all rolled into one. You're a glorified spreadsheet in a feathered cape. Your feet carry you up narrow stairs to the next ceremonial duty. The day has just begun. The gods are watching, and so is your supervisor. You emerge into the courtyard just as the first sunbeams slant across the temple walls, making the stone carvings shimmer like they're waking up to, though in a much better mood than you. It's hot already. Not gently warming your back hot, but oppressive, soupy, forehead dripping hot. And it's not even mid-morning. You mop your brow with a cloth that used to be white several festivals ago and blink into the sunlight, trying not to stagger on the stairs. The space you inhabit your residence, if one wants to call it, that sits halfway between a monk's cell and a broom closet. Its walls are thick enough to keep you barely cool, but not thick enough to mute the chants, drums, and occasional goat wails of temple life. Your sleeping mat is woven from reeds that feel like being hugged by a porcupine, and you share your modest square footage with a gourd of old drinking water, a dried-up frog that used to be a pet you think, and a pile of manuscripts you swear are multiplying while you sleep. Your neighbors include the scribe, who thinks he's the reincarnation of tzolk'in, and a part-time tooth puller who moonlights as a stargazer. Between them, your nights are punctuated by midnight humming, grinding obsidian, and the occasional shout of "I told you it was a waxing moon," privacy a concept as mythical as a day off. You've trained for this life since you were a child, taken from your family willingly or otherwise. Historians still argue, and brought to the temple because your birth date matched some favorable star alignment. Lucky you. It's sort of like winning a scholarship to a school where failure means divine wrath, and the final exam happens every single morning. The temple structure is, admittedly, a marvel. Polished limestone steps, murals of gods feasting and bleeding with equal enthusiasm, and a looming central pyramid that casts a judgmental shadow over you all day. But you don't get to admire it much. You're too busy hauling water from the nearest cenote, helping to prepare the day's offerings, or praying that the young apprentice doesn't mix up the jaguar bones with the turkey ones again. Not that anyone can tell the difference. But still, your official sleeping arrangements are basic. But unofficially, you've napped on ceremonial platforms, under half-carved stelae, and once, very memorably, inside a giant jaguar mask after a particularly taxing lunar eclipse. You dream in glyphs now. Literal dreams of numbers chasing you down jungle paths, while gods laugh overhead. It's not restful, but it's thematically consistent. And while the outside world believes priests are serene, enlightened, and constantly floating on spiritual bliss, the truth is, you're mostly tired, chronically, spiritually, and emotionally tired. You've never touched a cacao bean in your life. Those are for nobles, and your breakfast is usually a maize cake the size and density of a roof tile, with maybe some squash if the gods are generous. Oh, and about those gods, they do not sleep in. You begin your morning prayers around the time birds begin screaming, and end them when your voice is hoarse and your legs are cramping from kneeling. You chant the long count dates aloud, a ritual that keeps time itself from unraveling, or at least convinces everyone it's not unraveling, which is almost the same thing. And here's a quirky tidbit. It's not just the date that matters, it's the tone of the date. Each day sign is paired with a number tone that dictates its vibe, its mood. You're not just saying, today is Ajah. You're saying, today is 8 Jaw. So let's avoid arguments. Maybe hold off on public beheadings. It's astrological forecasting with teeth. So, by mid-morning, you've already decoded the day, conducted 2 purification rituals, avoided stepping on a snake, and answered 3 whispered questions from junior priests about what happens if you miscalculate the solstice. Answer nothing, or possibly war. As you settle into your first real task, recording today's observations in a codex written on bark paper, you feel the crushing weight of cosmic responsibility. One wrong glyph, and someone in the outer provinces might build a temple staircase in the wrong direction. And yes, that actually happened once. Your eyes itch from lack of sleep. Your knees ache from praying on stone, and your stomach growls for something that didn't come out of a communal gourd. But you soldier on, stylus in hand, sweat pooling in your sandals. Just another glorious day in sacred service. You'd think, given your exalted role as a calendar priest caretaker of cosmic order, tracker of eclipses, translator of divine whispers, that the gods might grant you one small mercy, a dignified bathroom. They do not. The temple complex has many altars, many staircases, many highly symbolic pits for sacrifices. It does not, however, have what a modern person might call toilets. No gleaming porcelain thrones here, just an unmarked corner behind the astronomy platform, discreetly shielded by a crumbling frieze of a serpent devouring the sun. Very inspiring. To relieve yourself, you sneak off during a lull in rituals, praying no one notices you walking a little too quickly, clutching a leaf. Your options are limited. There's a hole dug hastily into the ground, surrounded by buzzing flies and haunted by the ghost of a compost pile. It's an ecosystem all its own. You squat. You regret. You rise a slightly more humble person. There is no toilet paper. Of course. What you have is bark, sometimes moss, occasionally a shredded piece of last week's miscopied codex. It's a tactile experience, to say the least. You develop preferences this sapling leaf over that one. You avoid the glossy ones unless you enjoy unexpected rashes. It's nature's version of Russian roulette. The olfactory ambiance is formidable. You try to breathe through your mouth, which in this heat is a gamble. Insects dance like celebrants at your personal humiliation. Ants conduct raids. Wasps express strong opinions. Sometimes a fry watches silently from a rock. Judging you? Now, you might wonder, why not a latrine, a shared facility perhaps, where one might suffer in solidarity? Well, the Maya have public toilets of a sort, pits outside of common residences, used with varying degrees of care. But here in the temple, sanitation is a whispered topic, addressed with the same enthusiasm one might use to discuss plague. Historians still argue whether the elite priests were exempt from manual waste disposal, or if they, too, drew lots for who had to empty the ceremonial chamber pot. There are fragments of murals showing a kneeling figure carrying what may be a vessel of something. You choose to interpret that optimistically. In the dry season, things are at least predictable sun-baked waste, solidish footing during the rainy season. However, your sacred sandals squelch ominously, and you become intimately acquainted with the concept of splash radius. The mud becomes a liar, promising stability and delivering chaos. And yes, your status as a holy calendar interpreter does not spare you from this. The gods, it seems, appreciate humility. Perhaps they even demand it. And nothing humbles you faster than slipping in your own footpath and landing near a beetle with a look of eternal disappointment. It's not all bad, though there's a kind of meditative quiet out there. Behind the serpent frieze, a chance to think, reflect, plan your glyphs, count your days, and mentally review the sequence of Venus's rise and fall. Unless a monkey steals your loincloth mid-squat. That happened once. He wore it for hours, prancing around like the sun god himself. Water is not readily available near the sacred latrine, so cleanliness is more of a theory than a practice. You scrape your hands clean with sand, or, on a lucky day, wipe them on one of the apprentice's tunics. He probably deserved it. And if you're truly desperate, there's a purification incense ritual you can perform afterward. Mostly it just makes the entire temple smell faintly of burning pumpkin seed and shame. Still, you carry on. Stars don't wait. The calendar must turn. Even if your bowels protest. Every now and then, during a long ceremony, you see your fellow priests doing the subtle leg shift dance, the one that says, "I should not have eaten that dried maize cake from 2 nights ago." You nod in understanding. Brotherhood is forged in glyphs and gastrointestinal peril. And yet, somehow, you endure, you adjust, you adapt. You find joy in tiny victories, finding a smooth, flat stone, making it back without mosquito bites in uncomfortable places. Welcome to priesthood. May the gods smile upon your digestive tract. Food. In the grand palace of the late classic Maya is supposed to be sacred, ritual, symbolic, divine. That's the theory. Anyway, in practice, the divine tastes a lot like fermented maize and disappointment. As a calendar priest, you do not hunt, farm, or cook. You interpret, chant, and gesture dramatically at celestial events. Meals are brought to you. And, oh, how you come to dread that little clay bowl set at your feet twice a day? Contents are rarely a surprise. Spoiler, it's tamales. Again, but not the kind with succulent fillings and festive colors you might imagine. No, your tamales are often bland, slightly undercooked, and wrapped so tightly in leaf you sometimes chew more wrapper than dough. Inside, if the gods are generous, you'll find a sliver of squash or a lonely black bean. If not, well, there's texture. Your main dish most days is atoll, a watery maize gruel. It arrives lukewarm, with the consistency of regret and a faint sour note that hints at questionable fermentation. On rare occasions, it includes cacao. That's a good day, not because it tastes great, but because at least it briefly masks the ever-lingering aftertaste of limestone grit. You don't ask why there's grit. You just accept. There's no cutlery. You eat with your hands, right hand only, because the left is reserved for, let's say, other business. You sit cross-legged on the floor, or perch on a low stone bench, trying to pretend your legs aren't going numb, and your fingers aren't sticky from yesterday's half-washed, honey-glazed squash. Protein, a whispered dream. Every few weeks there might be a thin broth made from turkey bones, mostly bones. The meat is for the rulers. You might gnaw a shard of cartilage if you're lucky. Once, someone dropped a chunk of iguana tail in your soup. You cried. Not from joy, just because it was warm, chewy, and didn't taste like failure. You dream of salt. Real salt. Not the muddy mineral scrape passed off as seasoning. The Maya did use salt, Of course, it was traded, stored, even taxed, but not generously doled out to mid-tier priests who read stars but don't predict war outcomes. Historians still argue whether calendar priests received more ritual food offerings during solstice festivals, or if that was reserved only for the diviner priests and ballgame champions. Your snacks are equally uninspiring. Roasted corn kernels, but so hard they threaten to undo what few teeth remain. Dried fruit technically. A smear of mashed papaya on a leaf does not a feast make. And for dessert, tzolk'in, fermented sap with a bouquet of despair. It gets the job done, if the job is to lull you into forgetting that you once tasted real honey. And speaking of honey, it's rare, treasured, and hoarded by the elite like edible gold. You once saw a drop of honey fall onto the floor. 4 priests dove for it like it was a falling star. You're not starving, not technically, but you are slowly withering into a maize-based life form. Your dreams are now corn-themed. You wake in the middle of the night whispering, not another tortilla. And yet, despite it all, food is ritual. Each bite, no matter how joyless, connects you to the gods. You give thanks before and after, more out of habit than sincerity. Iyi Saba. You perform a blessing over your gourd bowl, even when it holds something that smells like damp sandalwood and tastes like sadness. Some say Maya priests could fast for days, surviving on mere droplets of sacred cacao and divine breath. Some say those priests also hallucinated their calendars into existence. Historians still argue whether those fasts were holy or just indigestion-induced visions. The sun sets. You scrape the last crust of tamale from the bowl. You do not ask what the crunch was. You do not ask what moved just then under the leaf. You just bow your head, thank the maize god, and pray tomorrow's meal doesn't stare back. You wake before dawn, as always, not because you're eager to seize the cosmic day, but because your tunic is itchy. Again, the same tunic. In fact, that you've worn for 6 weeks straight. The same tunic that once resembled white cotton, but now looks like it moonlights as a sacrificial cloth. There are no closets in your priestly chamber, just a hook carved into the limestone where your outer wrap hangs like a deflated ghost. Maya calendar priests are technically part of the elite class, but don't let that fool you. Your wardrobe consists of one hand-woven tunic, an outer mantle, a threadbare belt, and sandals that died several solstices ago but refused to leave your feet. Let's talk about those sandals. Made of thick agave fiber, they are technically footwear, but more accurately, they are open invitations to blisters. One thong always comes loose when you walk uphill. The other has developed a sentient hatred for your left toe. And the parasites, always with the parasites, lice in your scalp, fleas around the ankles, occasional stings from wasps that mistake your mantle for a hut. You scratch so often, your skin develops its own topography. Historians still argue whether Maya priests accepted lice as spiritual companions or simply didn't have the time to care. Bathing could help. Theoretically, but you're a calendar priest. You don't have time to soak in the cenote every morning when Venus might be rising 3 minutes early. Besides, some believe overwashing offends certain gods. And your scent? It's a blend of maize sweat, incense residue, and quiet despair. A kind of spiritual aromatherapy, if you squint hard enough. Laundry is an elite service, unless you're one of the royal priesthood or a high diviner. You're doing your own washing, or rather, not doing it. Because time is a thing sacrificed on the altar of endless glyphs. And there are no laundry tablets, no suds. You pound your clothes with a rock and hope for the best, mostly. The best is a tunic that's less brown than before. Your ceremonial headdress though. It's stunning. Bright quetzal feathers, jade beads, a gold thread if you're lucky. It's also 40 degrees Celsius. And the headdress feels like you're wearing a flaming chicken on your head. You sweat through the embroidery, and the feathers wilt by noon. But you can't take it off because the gods are watching. Or your superior is, possibly both. And yet this is considered noble attire. You are not a peasant in a bark fiber loincloth. No, you wear the traditional white garments of spiritual clarity, even if they smell like fermented beans and your belt has been chewed on by a rat. During festivals, you add body paint ochre in charcoal lines that itch like they were drawn with regret. Sometimes it rains, and the pigment runs. You become a smudged celestial map. People still bow, though, because you hold the count of days. There are rituals that require nudity, of course, symbolic purification, exposure to the elements, and other glorious opportunities for mosquito bites in unmentionable places. During the Venus evening ritual last month, you had to stand still for an hour while ants staged a military parade across your thigh. Your hands, always holding codices or drawing glyphs, are cracked, stained, and calloused. Ink made of charcoal, plant resin, and sometimes crushed beetle is impossible to remove. Your fingernails are permanently blackened. People think it's mystical. It's just poor sanitation and commitment. And yet, every part of your garment has meaning. Every knot, every thread. You are a walking calendar, a flesh-wrapped symbol of the cosmos. The irony, you still haven't figured out how to sit comfortably without your robe riding up and revealing more priest than intended. So you do what you always do. You straighten the mantle. You ignore the chafing. You smear on another layer of clay-based sunblock and hope it keeps the biting flies and social judgment at bay. The Maya believe the gods see through fabric into your spirit, but you suspect they can also smell you. You try to smile through the pain, but it's hard when your teeth feel like they're hosting a war between bone and nerve. There's a dull throb in your molars, a constant reminder that calendar priests, despite decoding celestial secrets, can't decode the mysteries of oral hygiene. You chew slowly. Maize cakes and boiled beans are your staples, but each bite is a gamble. Sometimes the beans are overcooked mush. Sometimes they're calcified spheres of doom. And when a jagged kernel cracks a weakened tooth, you see stars. Not metaphorical ones, literal. Pounding lights in your skull. Toothbrushes don't exist. Not even a humble twig to fray and scrub with. You've tried rinsing with river water before, but that just invited more bacteria to the party already happening in your gums. Your breath could kill small rodents, and you're fairly sure one molar is held in place by nothing but stubbornness and prayer. Here's a fringe detail. Some Maya used stingray spines or obsidian blades for tooth decoration. They'd carve small holes into healthy enamel, then insert tiny jade beads, a beautiful tradition. Unless, of course, it gets infected, which it often does. Scholars still argue whether these practices were spiritual, aesthetic, or a combination of divine dentistry and peer pressure. You haven't had the jade bead treatment yet? Lucky you, but you do have cavities. Dozens of them. You're a calendar priest, not a cacao merchant. You can't afford the honey infusions to soothe the ache, and the daily offerings of roasted corn don't exactly go down like warm pudding when the pain becomes unbearable. There's one solution extraction, done by force, no anesthetic, just a helper with strong arms, a woven cord, and the blessed tool, a pair of wooden tongs soaked in salt water and optimism. They say the gods favor those who suffer. By that logic, you're a celestial favorite. Blood spills, The socket throbs for days. If infection sets in, you keep working anyway, charting eclipses and rain cycles while tasting iron. There's a kind of dignity in it, like bleeding for the calendar. But mostly, it just hurts. The worst part, there's no real cure. Maya medicine excels at herbal remedies, poultices, and rituals. But when it comes to dental care, they're more likely to burn incense and chant over you than offer a clean extraction. The concept of bacteria doesn't exist. Instead, pain is seen as a spiritual imbalance, probably caused by forgetting a ritual offering 2 equinoxes ago. Once, an older priest told you to bite on a charcoal stick soaked in chili. It'll burn the pain out. He said, it did. It also burned your gums, tongue, and trust in the elderly still. You press on. You smile when the nobles pass by. You read glyphs to children whose teeth are still intact. You accept that your mouth is a mosaic of cracks, gaps, and haunted nerves. And if someone asks why your face twitches during chants, you say you're channeling divine energy, not that you're trying not to cry when a gust of wind hits an exposed nerve. You've developed tricks, pressing your tongue against the sore spot to distract from chewing pain, avoiding cold water like it's cursed, which it may be, and always chewing on the left side. The right has declared independence and wants nothing to do with your nutritional needs. Ironically, the calendar you help maintain contains dates for medical ceremonies, festivals of healing, days of purification. But there's no glyph for abscess, no symbol for root canal, just you and your cracked smile, trying to divine the movements of Venus while your molars launch a rebellion. And when you finally drift to sleep after a long day of chanting, carving, and calendrical alignment, it's not dreams of starlight or cosmic balance that come to you. It's the soft, lingering wish for a soft toothbrush. Before the sun even hints at rising, you're already awake, not from eagerness, but because a mosquito has declared war on your ear canal. You slap at it half-heartedly, roll off your woven mat, and brace for another day of holy calculations and deeply unholy labor. Yes, you're a calendar priest. Yes, you live inside the ceremonial compound. No, that doesn't mean you're free from chores. That myth is for tourists and naive apprentices. In truth, your life is split cleanly in two, half skywatching, half backbreaking. Today's task, hauling limestone to the scribal platform. Because someone in the hierarchy decided the temple of glyphs needs a new stairway, you, being both literate and alive, are the ideal candidate to assist. The logic is unclear, but arguing would be a worse fate than manual labor, probably involving demotion, shame, and extra night shifts with the bone flute choir. You wrap a cloth around your head, splash tepid water on your face, and head out. The quarry is downhill. The temple is uphill. And the rocks are never in the right place. You lift, grunt, and wobble underweight, clearly designed by gods with a dark sense of humor. This isn't unique to you. Labor is the spine of Maya society. Most peasants spend their entire lives carrying, digging, weaving, or planting. Women shell corn until their fingers bleed, then cook it into mesa while rocking babies on their backs. Children, they start helping at 5, not with toys, with the tools. Historians still argue whether this early labor instilled pride or simply crushed childhood. As for other jobs, none offer rest. Blacksmiths bake in soot. Tanners soak hides in urine, a real scent adventure. And builders perch on precarious scaffolding using ropes that wouldn't pass any modern safety test. You once helped reset a roof beam and ended up with splinters so deep they became part of your personality. Still, there's something oddly rhythmic about it all. Each grunt has a purpose. Each blister tells a story. The temple stones you stack today will outlive your teeth, your children, maybe even the sun. You tried to take pride in that. Lunch break, kind of. You get a handful of tamales wrapped in banana leaves, still warm from a communal pit. No meat. Of course, just bean paste and the faint aroma of someone else's sweat. You eat sitting in the shade of a carved stela, trying not to drip sauce on the glyphs of your ancestors. They're watching, judging, probably laughing. One of the senior priests walks by with his nose held high, a feathered headdress swaying dramatically. He nods at your effort but doesn't stop to help. That's the unspoken rule of sacred hierarchy. Those who interpret the stars must also lift the stones, unless they've aged into decorative furniture. You've heard rumors of temple slaves, captives from other cities made to do the heavy lifting. But in your case, you're the unlucky blend of brain and brawn. A divine pack mule, and no one even offers you fermented cacao. Later in the afternoon, your real priestly duties begin. You wipe the dust from your robes, smear some ochre paste on your arms, and take your place on the temple's observation ledge. The stars must be recorded. Venus is shifting. The rains are coming. Your legs shake. Your arms ache. Your spine is folding into the shape of a question mark. But your stylus doesn't tremble, not yet. The codex must be accurate, or the planting season will collapse and everyone will look at you like you personally offended the maize god. So you draw. You chant. You bleed a little from the palm ceremonial. Of course, nothing like a tiny self-inflicted paper cut to spice up your evening. And when you finally slump back onto your mat, muscles twitching like frogs in the rain, you tell yourself you've earned rest. But there's still firewood to gather. The stars don't provide shade. That's one of the earliest truths you learn as a calendar priest. You may spend your days tracking solstices, eclipses, and the moods of Venus, but none of it stops the sky from trying to kill you. In the wet season, it begins as a haze. The jungle swells with humidity, so thick you could cut it with your obsidian knife. Your cotton tunic thin, already stiff with dried sweat, clings to your back like a judgment. The sun isn't a heavenly body, it's a radiant tyrant, perched directly overhead, melting your thoughts, like maize in boiling water. You try to work under a palm awning, but the bugs have claimed it as their office space. Mosquitoes, gnats, and beetles, some with wings. Some with questionable social boundaries, form a buzzing choir that never rests. You scratch your arms, flick away flies, and resume your calculations. The calendar stops for no one, not even a priest with a heat rash. Then comes the rain. Not a drizzle, not a gentle mist, a thundering, roof-peeling, soul-washing downpour that floods the plaza in minutes. Your hut, expertly engineered from reeds and wishful thinking, lets in a fine vertical stream right onto your sleeping mat. You gather your belongings, raise the mat on bricks, and pretend you're camping in a swampy resort. Historians still argue whether these flood patterns were seasonal or evidence of divine punishment. You have your own theory. Gods just get bored. Dry season offers a different sort of hostility. At first, it's a relief, no more mildew on your codices. But that illusion shatters quickly. The heat becomes a wall. The earth cracks. Your lips split. The trees shed their leaves like panicked birds. Fire becomes both a danger and a necessity. Cook fires smoke out insects, but also attract jaguars who seem interested in your tortillas. At night, the wind dies, and the air hangs motionless, as if time itself is stuck. You lie awake on your mat, limbs spread like a starfish, waiting for the universe to breathe again. It doesn't. Not until 3 a.m., when a single, merciful breeze tiptoes across your ankle and leaves before you can thank it. Your clothing does little to help. Cotton loincloths and loose tunics might seem comfortable until they stiffen with salt. You haven't had dry underwear in 3 months. And footwear, sandals made from bark and flattened regrets. One wrong step on a jungle trail, and you're barefoot again, limping past scorpions. Even the ceremonial robes betray you. Woven from thick dyes and layered with beads, they turn into portable saunas during rituals. You try not to faint mid-incantation, but it's happened. Once, you collapse face first into a bowl of incense. The head priest said it was a sign. You suspect it was heat stroke. Winters, when they come, aren't much better. Nights in the highlands turn bitterly cold. You huddle beneath a jaguar skin blanket procured from a royal hunt. Very prestigious, very moth-eaten, and hope your breath doesn't freeze in your nose. There's no firewood, because hauling logs uphill in summer seemed like a problem for future you. Well, here he is, miserable and shivering, even inside the palace compound. Climate is an invisible boss. It affects the crops, which affect the food, which affects the priests, which affects the calendar, which ironically predicts the climate. You spend your days drawing sacred spirals to explain why the seasons are uncooperative, and your nights wondering if that lightning bolt was divine wrath or just atmospheric instability. Still, you wake up the next morning. The sun rises on cue. You splash cold water on your face and whisper a quick apology to Chak, the rain god, just in case. Then you check the sky and reach for your stylus. Another 260-day cycle begins, whether you're ready or not. It's dawn again, and your first job, before scratching your flea bites or dodging the palace dogs, is to check the water jars. Not because you're thirsty, because you're anxious. There's a difference. Water in the palace compound is like gossip shared, murky, and possibly lethal. You shuffle to the cistern, housed in a carefully dug reservoir, lined with lime plaster. It looks elegant. It smells complicated. You scoop a gourdful and sniff. It passes the test, meaning it doesn't hiss, bubble, or contain tadpoles today. You drink it anyway. You don't have much choice. Rainwater is prized, but unpredictable. And hauling it from sacred cenotes means descending slippery, bat-infested stairs, and praying your rope doesn't snap mid-blessing. The gods may have created these shimmering limestone wells for purity, but they forgot to install guardrails. And yet, bathing is worse. You do it sparingly. Not because you're lazy or humble, but because most calendar priests agree bathing is basically witchcraft. The classic Maya believed that washing too often weakened your protective spirits. It opened your spirit layer to intrusion sickness, misfortune, or worse, sniffles. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were rooted in spiritual tradition or a pragmatic response to limited clean water. Probably both. Definitely both. So, when you finally bathe, perhaps on the feast day of Ixchel, goddess of healing, you do it ceremonially. There's incense, sacred chants, and someone drawing glyphs on your back with red clay. You step into a steam bath, or temazcal, which is supposed to cleanse body and soul. And it does if you survive the process. The temazcal is a small dome chamber filled with scalding steam, no ventilation, and the combined humidity of a rainforest in July. You kneel beside sizzling stones, sweating from places you didn't know had pores. While a novice pours herb-infused water onto the heat and chants about balance and renewal, you nod encouragingly as your lungs plead for mercy. There's no exit without embarrassing yourself. So you endure. The experience is sacred and a little bit stupid. Later, you collapse outside like a boiled squash, grateful, clean, and convinced you saw the face of Kukulkan in the condensation. You will not do this again for several months, maybe years. Back in daily life, you manage water like a miser with coins. You sip it slowly. You ration it for ink making, food boiling, and spiritual rituals. You purify it with charcoal, or, when desperate, by chanting over it and hoping no one notices the beetle floating on top. And if you get sick, diarrhea, worms, fevers, welcome to the sacred experience of being human in the jungle. There's no real cure, just time, prayer, and fermented cacao to help you forget. The most dreaded scenario is cholera-like outbreaks in the compound. They spread like whispered curses, striking down servants and nobles alike. One day you're discussing planetary alignments. The next, your neighbor is wrapped in woven reeds and carted off for a funeral pyre. It keeps you humble and alert. Yet, water is not just danger, it's also beauty. The carved gutters, the reflecting pools, the glistening drops on jungle vines, it's a daily reminder of life's fragility and the gods' indifference. You spend hours etching glyphs to mark lunar eclipses in sacred aquifers, hoping to convince the divine that you respect the balance. Sometimes, during evening rituals, you stand beside the reflecting basin in the temple courtyard. The stars shimmer on the water's surface. The humidity presses against your robes. And for a moment, just a moment, you feel serene. You, the water, and time, flowing silently together. The jungle sleeps. You stretch out on your woven mat, limbs heavy, mind drifting like mist across a starlit pool. The fireflies blink lazily beyond the slatted walls, and the distant sound of drums fades into a heartbeat, rhythm slow, steady, ancient. Your bones ache in that familiar way, not from labor, but from simply surviving. The stone steps, the rituals, the heat, the rain, they've worn grooves into your body, like water shaping rock. And still, you're here. The air cools. The clay roof no longer sweats. Outside, the sacred ceiba tree sways in the night breeze. You close your eyes and let go of the calendar, the gods, the ticks, the prayers. Just for now, breathe in the darkness. Exhale the day. You've made it through enough. Now, we drift into palaces made of red sandstone and cool white marble. You sit beneath a carved arch in the Mughal Zenana, the women's quarters where jasmine-scented air clings to silk veils. And someone is sobbing softly behind a curtain embroidered with gold thread. Welcome to the royal court, where power flows through marriages like perfume through the marble halls. You would never think that a bride weighed in bangles and brocade might have no more say in her future than a chess piece. And yet, here we are. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Because this story winds through silence palaces and stiff drawing rooms, and you'll want to stay with me. You trudge into the Mughal court of the 16th century, where everything is majestic except personal choice. In this glittering empire, marriage is not a celebration of love. It's a political event. Your hand might be offered not because someone loves you, but because your uncle controls a river, or worse, because your father lost a war. You don't fall in love, you fall into an alliance. The emperor doesn't ask you to marry, he informs you. The mainstream fact: Mughal emperors, especially those like Humayun and Akbar, built empires not only through battle, but through marriage. They married women from rival dynasties and former enemy clans to seal political deals with the daintiest of handshakes, one that came with mehendi and a reluctant bride. Akbar alone is believed to have had over 300 wives, many of them Rajput princesses. Each marriage came with land, troops, or loyalty stitched in. But let's not forget the fringe side of things. Some royal women were married so young, they likely hadn't finished learning to read the Quran or to walk across a marble floor without tripping on their own jewelry. There are tales of Mughal princesses who were married off as early as 10. Bundled into wedding finery like glittering parcels, no one consulted. It was all smiles and ceremonial elephants until the guests left. Historians still argue whether these girls fully understood the politics they were absorbed into. Some say they were mere tokens, beautiful signatures at the bottom of peace treaties. Others believe these young brides learned how to bend those golden cages into power platforms, whispering influence through silken curtains, forming alliances in the shadows of the harem. And while the empire projected unity, the reality could be brutal. The bride's religion, often a mere footnote. Akbar famously allowed Hindu wives to keep their traditions, which sounds lovely until you remember they still didn't choose him. Consent here was like a piece of ceremonial fruit, offered, admired, never questioned. The opulence of the Mughal world is overwhelming ivory combs, mangoes carved like jewels, dances under chandeliers made of crystal. But somewhere behind those lavish backdrops, behind the perfume and poetry, sits a girl in velvet, wondering when she became a royal strategy. You haven't moved, but now you're in a different wing of the palace. The drapes are heavier, the gold is thicker, and the stakes, they've just gone sky high. Because now you're watching the Emperor Akbar assemble the most politically useful harem in the history of the subcontinent. This isn't a love story. It's a kingdom-building starter pack. Spoiler alert, you are the princess. And your wedding gift is the ability to never leave again. Akbar the Great. Yes. The one history teachers like to frame as benevolent and wise was also a master at collecting brides like rare postage stamps. The mainstream historical fact here is this: Akbar forged alliances with powerful Hindu Rajput kingdoms by marrying their daughters. It wasn't a scandal. It was genius-level diplomacy. Dressed in silks and accompanied by elephants, he wasn't just marrying women. He was marrying armies, fortresses, and tax revenue. These Rajput princesses, often raised in proud warrior households, were expected to abandon their lives overnight. They didn't get to swipe left. And while some were allowed to keep practicing Hinduism within the Zanana, they were still very much part of an imperial scheme. A beautiful hostage situation with matching bangles. Now, here comes the quirky twist, according to some fringe accounts. Not all these royal women went along with the plan as meekly as the records suggest. There's one tale buried between courtly flattery and Mughal propaganda that one of Akbar's wives continued to hold secret Hindu rituals in defiance of conversion. A tiny oil lamp hidden behind a curtain, a whispered mantra under her breath, a private rebellion lit by ghee. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerated, symbolic, or entirely true. Some insist these women held surprising influence within the Mughal court, not just through childbearing, but through counsel, culture, and yes, managing complicated relationships among dozens, even hundreds of wives. Others say those glimpses of power were just crumbs handed out in an enormous, polished cage. You wonder, did Akbar's queens feel like diplomats or prisoners? Were they honored as bridges between empires or quietly erased behind embroidered veils? Did they ever dream of something as scandalous as choosing their own husbands? The empire spun a romantic story about secular love and cross-cultural unity. But it was unity on one man's terms. He got the loyalty, the land, and the military peace. The princess got a title, maybe a garden, and the privilege of dining 2 rooms away from her husband while he married wife number 53. But every now and then, there's a moment, a faint record of a royal wife requesting a temple be built, or a poem she sponsored, or a tutor she hired for her son. Subtle acts, but deliberate. Not escape, but assertion. A declaration. I am not just silk and silence. I am here, and I am thinking. So you press deeper into the shadows of the Mughal court, where the wedding garlands are fresh, but the bride's smile may be quietly cracked beneath them. You slip now into quieter corridors, where the music has faded and only the soft rustle of silk remains. This is the part of the palace they don't show in paintings aback of the back, where forgotten queens look out from latticed windows, or jharokas, and wonder what became of their lives. You can almost hear the breath of one of them, Empress Ruqayya, as she stares through filigree and counts the hours like pearls slipping from a broken string. You would think that marrying into the most powerful empire in South Asia came with perks. And yes, the floors are marble. The courtyards bloom year-round. And your earrings are probably worth more than most villages. But still, you can't leave. You can't choose. You certainly can't say no. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Mughal royal women, especially the high-ranking ones, were often locked into lifelong roles dictated by the politics of empire. But unlike some might assume, they weren't always invisible. Many of them, like Ruqayya Sultan Begum, Akbar's chief wife, held influence in courtly decisions, managed vast estates, and served as political advisors from behind the screen. Which sounds empowering until you remember they couldn't leave. remarry, or even publicly speak without protocol approval. And now for the wonderfully strange bit. One fringe story tells of a Mughal princess who outright refused a second political marriage after becoming a widow, in a world where her value was tied entirely to marital usefulness. This was basically slapping the empire in the face with a bejeweled glove. But here's the irony. She wasn't punished. Not openly. Instead, her life became one of quiet isolation, allowed to read, write, fund poetry, but kept in ceremonial limbo, like a museum piece no one wants to admit is gathering dust. Historians still argue whether these refusals were acts of resistance or simply personal grief, mistaken for political rebellion. Did these women reject power, or were they rejecting the conditions in which they were expected to wield it? It's a long-standing debate with no clear answer, and that's what makes it fascinating. From behind the Jaroka, some royal women shaped dynasties. They educated heirs, secretly brokered alliances, even intervened in courtly appointments. Their tools weren't swords, but literacy, charity, and the timeless art of appearing to be silent while hearing everything. When you can't speak freely, you learn to whisper wisely. Still, there's an ache beneath the glamour. These women, call them empresses, call them property, were often reduced to ceremonial roles by the very machinery they upheld. Imagine walking through your garden, knowing you designed the whole thing, and yet someone else takes credit for the scent of the roses. So you settle here for a moment, in this in-between space of veiled power. You listen to the scratch of a reed pen on parchment, the rustle of a sari being rearranged, the heavy exhale of someone who has everything except agency. It's not loud rebellion. It's not escape. But it's something. A quiet echo behind every grand portrait. And just beyond that carved window, the next wedding procession is already being prepared. You step out of the marble courts of Hindustan and right into the frost-bitten etiquette of Victorian Britain, where everything is pressed, powdered, and painfully polite. Here, in drawing rooms filled with teacups and disapproval, marriage isn't just expected, it's choreographed. You're not a daughter, you're a dowry in a dress. And the worst crime, saying no without saying it sweetly. Welcome to a world where forced marriage wears a corset and smiles for the portrait. Unlike the Mughal court, where alliances were draped in jewels, Victorian England prefers its oppression subtle, laced up with moral instruction and a side of cucumber sandwiches. If you're a girl of any station, your future depends on practicing the piano, blushing on cue, and learning to faint delicately when someone mentions France. Here's the mainstream fact. In 19th century Britain, daughters of the gentry and upper classes were trained from childhood to marry well and buy well. We mean wealthy, landed, and male. Fathers had the legal right to arrange or heavily influence marriages, and defying that could result in financial exile or social ruin. Love could wait, or better yet, love could learn to cooperate. You'd think this would trigger open rebellion, but no. Because in Victorian culture, obedience was sold as virtue. And if you refused to follow the plan, the punishment wasn't fire, it was shame. You might be removed from the will, sent to live with a disapproving aunt in a colder part of the country, or worst of all, labeled difficult, a word more damning than bankrupt. Now, for a delightful little fringe tidbit. There's record of etiquette manuals given to daughters, including an inquiry into the duties of the female sex, essentially a pre-marriage instruction book with all the warmth of a tax return. Among the gems of wisdom, a lady must not speak in the presence of men unless spoken to. Translation: if you're unhappy about your marriage arrangement, try blinking twice in Morse code. Historians still argue whether these girls were fully powerless or simply participating in a social game whose rules they helped enforce. Some claim women use their social capital to influence suitors, tilt fortunes, and secure advantageous matches. Others argue that no amount of tea table manipulation could undo a marriage made by your father's bank account and your suitor's ancestry. And don't be fooled by the novels. Yes, Jane Austen's heroines often win love, but they do it within the rules. You don't run away with a stable boy. You don't marry a penniless poet. You marry a man with an estate, and if he happens to be tolerable company, that's just the cherry on top. So now, you're sitting at a parlor window, watching your future arrive in a top hat. He owns 3 waistcoats, 5 horses, and 0 personality. Your hands are folded, your hair is curled, and your options are tucked beneath a lace handkerchief. And the worst part, everyone calls this happiness. With enough floral upholstery, even imprisonment can look like a wedding. The piano tinkles in the next room, and you hear soft voices discussing your future as if you weren't even there. You're still in Victorian Britain, but deeper now, past the polite surface, past the doilies and debutante balls. This is the undercurrent, where even Queen Victoria herself, despite her love for Prince Albert, presided over a culture that told women exactly where they belonged. Spoiler, it wasn't the driver's seat of their own lives. The mainstream historical fact, married women in 19th century Britain had almost no legal identity. Under coverture laws, a married woman's property, income, and even her body legally belonged to her husband. If he wanted to sell the family cow, the dining chairs, or move to Scotland without her, he could, if she objected. The court would yawn politely and return to its pipe. Now imagine being forced into that system with no say at all. Imagine your father arranging the marriage not because the suitor was kind or interesting, but because he had a decent mustache and enough land to avoid embarrassment. Once married, your legal rights evaporate like steam off weak tea. Here's the fringe tidbit. In some upper-class households, forced marriage didn't even pretend to be gentle. Cases emerged quietly in whispered corners of drawing rooms of women being locked in their rooms until they agreed to the match, or of girls being sent abroad for education only to return weeks before the wedding to someone they barely remembered meeting. And if a bride wept during the vows, well, that was just sentimentality. How charming. Historians still argue whether some of these women were complicit in upholding the system for their own security, or whether they simply had no viable way to resist without losing everything. The line between internalized duty and silent rebellion is thin and sewn with lace, but there were cracks. You tiptoe toward them now. The rise of reformers, Mary Wollstonecraft's ghost hovering sternly over the parlor. Early suffragists murmuring about voting rights over tea. Some women began to push back. Subtly, they kept diaries that contradicted their letters. They arranged companionate marriages with men who actually listened. A few bold souls, even gasp, remained single. Society called them spinsters, but in private, some called them free. And then there's Eliza, a real woman, though rarely named, who famously sued for the right to her own income after marriage. It didn't go well, but it left a mark, a tiny legal splatter on the polished mirror of the patriarchy. You watch her now, framed in a corseted silhouette, slipping a letter under the table to a solicitor. Not love letters, legal ones. Her act is quiet, almost invisible, but you feel the ripple. Meanwhile, outside, the carriage pulls up. The groom steps out. He's punctual. His boots are shined. And he doesn't know your favorite book or care. The bouquet in your hands feels heavier than expected. But the room expects you to smile. So you do. Now you slip back across empires and oceans, back into the scented shadow of Mughal domes. But the glitter's faded. This isn't the first bloom of royal weddings anymore. It's the later chapters, the forgotten wives, the ones who survived the spectacle only to become silent scenery. Here in the dim corridors of Agra Fort, or the aging zananas of Lahore, you meet the real outcome of forced marriage, the lonely aftermath. You sit beside a widowed empress. She's still dressed in silks, but her bangles no longer sing. Her husband is gone either to war, another wife, or to grave, and now her entire role is reduced to existing. No love story, no pension, just endless days of embroidery and ceremonial appearances. Like a human museum piece with good posture. Your mainstream fact in Mughal tradition. Widows of emperors and high-ranking nobles were not permitted to remarry. That's it. One man, one contract, no matter how young you were when he died. Your life, essentially, froze. Sometimes literally. If you were sent to live in secluded quarters without political favor, the act of remaining unmarried wasn't about virtue. It was about control. Keeping power from slipping through female hands. And here's your unsettling fringe detail. Some of these women were so completely erased from the record. We don't even know their names, just the titles given to them. Like Begum of the Southern Courtyard or Lady in Blue. They became references in someone else's story, a side note in an emperor's diary, or a line in a eunuch's report. Their lives, once full of protocol and perfume, narrowed into stillness. Historians still argue whether some of these women wielded quiet influence behind palace walls or were truly rendered voiceless. Some suggest they played chess with visiting nobles, offered strategic advice through whispered couriers, or educated future kings in the art of diplomacy. Others believe that romanticizing these hidden figures risks glossing over the systemic silencing that shaped their lives. You might ask, what did they do all day? The answer is ritual, morning baths, prayer, poetry recitations, embroidery sessions so ornate they'd make a Pinterest board cry. Some became patrons of architecture or literature, their names preserved in the corners of mosques or beneath the covers of a handwritten manuscript. But love-choice companionship, that chapter had closed long ago with no sequel. And the young girl who'd once arrived here in a whirlwind of silk and elephant parades, they aged slowly, quietly, surrounded by mirrors that never lied and attendants who never listened. The palace still bustles. Beyond their walls, new brides arrive. Musicians perform. Foreign dignitaries tour, but here. In this part of the Zenana, time drips like melted wax. You sit on a cushion beside one of them. She smiles faintly, remembering a line of poetry. Then she returns to her needlework. You think this wasn't just a love story that never bloomed. It was a life that never got to turn the page. From embroidered silence to polished silverware, you drift now into another kind of exile, one lined with bone china and decorum. Back in Victorian Britain, the parlors are full of chatter, but the walls are thick with secrets. This is where the unhappy wives go, not to rebel, but to quietly unravel. You don't need a cage when the wallpaper is floral and the expectations are iron. Forced marriage, it turns out, doesn't always end with a tragic faint or a dramatic escape. Often, it just continues, day after day, year after year, until the bride becomes a wife. The wife becomes a fixture. And everyone pretends that's perfectly normal. Your mainstream historical fact. Once married. Victorian women were socially and often legally trapped. Divorce was not just rare, it was scandalous. Until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, only men could easily initiate divorce for adultery. Women, meanwhile, had to prove not just infidelity, but added cruelty or desertion. Translation: if your husband cheated, drank, gambled, and screamed, that was still considered Tuesday. And here's the fringe twist. Enter the Victorian rest cure. For women who reacted poorly to their gilded cages, those who grew listless, angry, or, heaven forbid, ambitious, the prescription was bed rest, weeks, sometimes months, of silence, isolation, and warm milk. No books, no visitors, no conversation. Just lie there and think about what you've done. It was marketed as medical care. In reality, it was a velvet-lined punishment for thinking too loudly. Historians still argue whether women like these were victims of institutional cruelty or symbols of a broader social breakdown. Some scholars point to literary heroines like Charlotte Perkins Gilman's narrator in The Yellow Wallpaper as fictionalized accounts of real desperation. Others argue that many women willingly internalize these roles, unable or unwilling to imagine an alternative. But behind the lace curtains and floral rugs, small rebellions brewed. Some women began writing under male pseudonyms. Others, quietly bold, started women's reading clubs groups that discussed radical ideas beneath the innocent guise of afternoon tea. One might slip a suffragist pamphlet between her psalms. Another might fund a school for girls without telling her husband. Tiny cracks, beautiful ones. You're sitting now on a stiff Victorian sofa beside one such wife. Her corset is pulled too tight, and she hasn't looked anyone in the eye for 20 minutes. But there's a fire in her gaze that suggests she once read Mary Wollstonecraft under the covers. She adjusts her gloves, nods politely, and files away your presence like a secret outside. The world's beginning to shift. Railways, telegraphs, even whispers of legal reform. But inside this house, time moves at the speed of a tea drip. You're not allowed to raise your voice, but maybe, just maybe, you can raise your eyebrows. And when your husband frowns, just remind him how delicate you are. Delicate like dynamite. You slip once more into the twilight gold of the Mughal world. But now you're not in a palace or court. You're at the edge where marriage meets power and power meets politics. And somewhere in that triangle, a teenage girl signs her life away with henna-stained fingertips. It's not her wedding day. It's her empire orientation in the Mughal court. Marriage was never personal. It was strategic. Every bride was a chess piece. Every union a treaty. You'd think that would at least earn you a spot at the table. But no. You're veiled, positioned, protected. Like a rare manuscript no one's allowed to read. Mainstream fact. Mughal emperors used marriage alliances to consolidate control across religious, regional, and linguistic boundaries. Akbar married Hindu princesses not because he was smitten by romantic poetry, but because he was building an empire that needed glue. And brides were excellent glue. Beautiful, silent, preferably fluent in several court languages. Now for the fringe. More suspicious detail. There are tales of young girls, sometimes as young as 10, sent from Rajput or Deccan courts into the Mughal palace as part of peace offerings. Not lovers, not companions, living contracts wrapped in silk. And while the record shows they were respected, one wonders how much respect tastes like when you're 13 and sitting beside a man with an empire in one hand and a wine goblet in the other. Historians still argue whether these women were victims or influencers, or both. Did they live out their days decorating palaces and raising sons? Or were they key players in diplomacy? Some chronicles suggest they built temples, endowed libraries, even petitioned on behalf of their natal families. Others show only absence, a quiet erasure buried under architecture and incense. Now you follow one of them. She walks with practiced grace, even though her anklets are too big. Her bridal veil slips from her head, and an attendant hurries to fix it because God forbid someone see her expression. She's led into a marble hall and introduced to a future she didn't choose. But she nods, smiles, bows. You can almost hear her thoughts saying, survive first, influence later. Because here's the hidden truth, forced marriage in the Mughal court wasn't always loud. It was wrapped in poetry, drenched in musk, announced with elephants and cannon fire. But at its core, still a deal sealed by signatures that bled through every silk pillow. You glance again at the girl. She's been gifted a palace wing, 3 personal tutors, and enough jewelry to sink a small boat. And yet, she knows. She knows that the price of peace is silence, that the price of favor is obedience, and that the only true freedom she'll ever have is what she dares to imagine behind closed curtains outside. The emperor smiles and orders another banquet. Inside, a bride begins to write her own story. Quietly, invisibly, one footnote at a time. And now, slowly, you return to the final chamber, the quietest of all. The clinking of teacups fades. The rustle of saris and corsets hushes into stillness. Here, between 2 worlds, Mughal palaces and Victorian parlors, you settle beside the women who bore it all. The brides who were traded, the wives who were silenced, the widows who were forgotten. Not queens of history books, but empresses of endurance. The mainstream fact across both empires. Forced marriage was rarely framed as coercion. It was duty, stability, culture, in textbooks. It's described as political strategy or family honor. But if you listen closely beneath the gold-threaded robes and lace bonnets, you'll hear the same muffled sigh. You're seated now with 2 women, one in a velvet drawing room, one in a marble courtyard. They've never met. They never will. But their lives rhyme. Both were married off before understanding what marriage meant. Both performed their roles with perfect posture. Both learned that saying no didn't mean rebellion, it meant consequences. And here's your final fringe detail in both worlds. A quiet literary resistance began to bloom. Some Mughal-era women turned to poetry in Persian or Braj, composing verses that dared to question fate. Some Victorian wives hid novels inside religious texts or wrote anonymous columns about their perfect marriages. Resistance didn't always look like protest. Sometimes it looked like a sigh spelled carefully in ink. Historians still argue whether these tiny acts meant true rebellion or just well-dressed despair. But what they do agree on is these women shaped the emotional history of their time. They were more than silent shadows. They were ghostwriters of the very systems that tried to erase them. You lean back now, feeling the echo of centuries in your spine. the bride whose name was never recorded, the wife who stitched sorrow into her pillowcase, the girl who smiled for a portrait while her soul made other plans. They're not stories, they're scars, decorated, powdered, perfumed, but scars all the same. And slowly, the imagery softens. You picture the candlelight dimming in a Mughal courtyard. You see a Victorian gas lamp flickering outside a townhome window. In both places, the night stretches long and slow, wrapping these women in the only peace they were ever allowed: sleep. Their hearts were never consulted, but they beat just the same. And so, you lie back now too. Let your breath slow. Let the silk and starch fall away. Let the voices fade, the palaces blur. The weight of all those bridal veils lift off your chest. Because for tonight, you don't have to marry anyone. You don't have to smile for the guests. You only have to rest. The past can keep its crowns and contracts. You can close your eyes. Now, we drift beneath the stars of Mesopotamia, where the stone towers of Babylon loom like divine antennas, and the air smells like incense and uncertainty. You shuffle barefoot past flickering oil lamps, each one a witness to the strangest meet-cutes you'll ever imagine. In a city where love was sacred, transactional, and possibly celestial. Finding a partner wasn't something you did on your own, no. The gods were involved, and sometimes so were the temple accountants. You would never think that falling in love required priestly approval and a payment receipt. But welcome to ancient Babylon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and the local time in the comments. I'm always curious how far bedtime history travels. You walk into the temple of Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and some frankly chaotic romantic policies. This isn't a temple like you'd imagine. It's part palace, part brothel, part Stargate to emotional confusion. According to classical writers like Herodotus, women here were expected at least once in their lives to offer themselves in the temple, not for worship through hymns or sacrifice, but for what he described as sacred prostitution. Supposedly, every woman, regardless of rank, had to wait in a temple courtyard until a stranger threw a coin into her lap and claimed her, at which point the ritual was performed in honor of Ishtar. But don't get too confident in this version. Historians still argue whether Herodotus got it right or if he just wildly misinterpreted a festival or slandered his geopolitical rivals. Babylonian clay tablets from the same era suggest a more nuanced story: rituals of fertility, formalized temple marriages, and priestesses with roles that had less to do with romance and more to do with reciting love poetry in ancient Sumerian. Still, fringe details abound, like the fact that ancient Babylonian men were known to write down entire love letters in cuneiform, press them into clay, and hand them to the object of their affection. These weren't casual flirts. They were full-on emotional essays. One preserved tablet opens with, "To my chosen one, the light of my eyes, the lioness of my heart." A little dramatic, sure. But who hasn't sent a risky text after 3 cups of fermented barley beer? And speaking of beer, one ritual involved newlyweds drinking a honey-based brew for a full lunar month following their wedding. Hence the term honeymoon. You sit beside them now, pretending you like the taste of thick, syrupy romance in clay mugs. But not everything was a festival of love. There were rules, contracts. Marriage was more a property exchange than an episode of The Bachelor. And yet, the emotional side still sneaks in between the lines of ancient codes, between the petals offered to Ishtar, between lovers praying not just to be desired, but to be remembered. So now, as you tiptoe back through the temple shadows, one clay tablet heavier in your dreams, remember this: in Babylon, love wasn't whispered. It was carved, chanted, and possibly taxed. You slip down the Nile now, beneath a painted ceiling of stars and eyes that never blink, into a world of lotus flowers, eyeliner, and love spells with more ingredients than a cursed smoothie. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where romance is half poetry and half potion, often brewed in a hurry and fed in secret. You find yourself in a scribe's chamber, where someone is grinding crocodile fat, myrrh, and what may or may not be fingernails into a little ceramic jar labeled irresistible. You would never think that seduction could involve something scraped off a corpse. But apparently, the gods were cool with multitasking. Here, love is not left to chance. It's summoned, called forth like a cat, graceful, moody, and slightly violent. The mainstream fact, love spells in Egypt weren't back alley superstitions. They were normal, even expected. You could visit a priest, a healer, or your local temple librarian and walk away with incantations promising to bind someone's heart to yours like linen to a mummy. And yes, some of these spells were romantic, others slightly stalkerish. One preserved papyrus charm reads, "May she not eat, not drink, not sleep, until she comes to me in love." Sweet. Right. Nothing says devotion like magically induced insomnia. But not all Egyptian love rituals were invisible. Some were wearable. Amulets made of gold, carnelian, or crocodile teeth were worn to attract affection, or at least ward off rivals. And for the extra superstitious, you'd write the name of your intended on a piece of parchment, stick it in a lizard's mouth, bury it under their doorstep, and wait for the sparks to fly. It was less Hallmark, more haunted house. Fringe tidbit: there's at least one known Egyptian charm involving brace yourself menstrual blood baked into bread and fed to a target as part of a love spell. Historians still argue whether this was ever common practice or if one rogue sorceress just had a particularly chaotic cookbook. Either way, you're not looking at your sourdough quite the same now. Are you? Then there's perfume. Oh, perfume. Egyptians believed smell was the highway to the soul. Both men and women wore wax cones on their heads that melted over time, releasing fragrance as a sort of slow burn, romantic signal. Forget body spray. This was aromatherapy for courtship, and also a gooey mess in hot weather. Still, it worked. Lovers sent each other scented letters, with oils dabbed into papyrus folds like olfactory emojis. But perhaps the strangest ritual came not from seduction, but heartbreak. Some spells weren't about bringing people together, but splitting them apart. With the help of a skilled scribe and the right offering, you could have your rival cursed, silenced, or just made to smell bad for a month. Petty, sure. Effective sometimes. Historians still argue whether these practices reflect deep spiritual belief or ancient attempts to cope with heartbreak using the best tools available: ink, incense, and crocodile goo. But one thing is clear: Egyptians never left love to chance. They summoned it, sculpted it, and if necessary, supernaturally sabotaged it. So now, as the scent of melted myrrh and singed hair drifts into your dreams, you realize in ancient Egypt, love wasn't blind. It was spellbound. You recline now on a cushioned stone bench under a vine-covered pergola in ancient Greece, where love is a sport, an art form, and occasionally a legally binding curse. The air smells like diluted wine and olive pits, and someone across the courtyard just locked eyes with you, tossed you an apple, and walked away. That, it turns out, is basically an engagement. You would never think a piece of fruit could carry that much romantic weight, but here, it's less of a snack and more of a proposal missile. You sip your wine, 3 parts water, 1 part actual grape, and listen as the conversation swells around you. The Greeks love love. They write about it, argue about it, and dedicate entire festivals to it. Aphrodite, goddess of love, has more temples than Zeus has excuses. But their rituals, they come with a twist. The mainstream fact is that romantic oaths and gestures were taken incredibly seriously, sometimes even recorded before witnesses. Giving someone a ring, a lock of hair, or even clothing meant you were halfway to a legal arrangement. But what really gets odd is how the Greeks handled jealousy. One love spell, found scratched into a lead tablet and buried in a graveyard, just casually, asks the underworld spirits to prevent a rival suitor from ever performing again. Yes, some spells targeted not the heart, but the nether regions, fringe detail. A few tablets even request that the rival's hair fall out and his goats get depressed. That's not just rejection. That's mythological level pettiness. And women weren't shy about magical interventions either. In a famous papyrus spell from Hellenistic Egypt-Greek culture, with a local twist, a woman calls on deities to bind her lover's affections to her, describing his body part by part. She wants his mind, heart, and liver to burn for her. Historians still argue whether these erotic spells were sincere magical acts, or just a dramatic form of poetic coping, sort of like ancient Tumblr posts carved into clay. Another charming tidbit: the Greeks believed that hiccups could be a sign someone was thinking lustful thoughts about you. So if you've got indigestion tonight, just pretend it's an oracle whispering secrets. Courtship wasn't all potions and curses, though the act of flirtation itself had structure. Men courted with poetry and gifts. Women often responded with wit or carefully timed silence. In Athens, love letters could double as legal evidence. If you gave someone your belt or headband as a romantic token and then tried to ghost them, congratulations. You might get sued. Sentimental value was taken very literally. And then there were the symposiums, boozy, toga-draped hangouts, where love was debated more than demonstrated. A favorite pastime was composing speeches on what kind of love was the best, which sounds intellectual until you realize half the crowd couldn't feel their faces from fermented honey. Still, these discussions shaped everything from personal ethics to political alliances. So as you curl up beside the wine-dark sea of ancient romance, one truth settles into your mind like olive oil into bread in grease. Love wasn't just a feeling, it was an argument, and everyone wanted the last word. Now you stroll along a Roman avenue, where marble statues look disapprovingly at your tunic, and every declaration of love comes with paperwork. The scent in the air is equal parts rose oil and legal ink. You pass a couple, whispering sweet nothings about dowries, land transfers, and inheritance clauses. You would never think that flirting could require a notary, but this is Rome, where even passion files taxes. The Roman Empire didn't leave much room for ambiguity in affairs of the heart. Love was fine, but marriage, that was a contract, a legal arrangement, a spreadsheet carved in stone. The mainstream fact is this Roman engagements were often formal, witnessed, and involved the transfer of symbolic tokens rings. Yes, but not the shiny kind. Engagement rings were typically made of iron, not gold, to represent strength and commitment. So basically, romance with a hint of metallurgy. And before marriage, girls bid farewell to their childhoods in dramatic fashion. One of the more poetic customs involved dedicating childhood toys like dolls to Venus, the goddess of love. This wasn't just cute, it was serious. You stood in the temple, placed your favorite doll on the altar, and said goodbye to girlhood with what was probably the ancient Roman version of an emotional Instagram caption. No takebacks, but for all its structured rigidity, Roman love had a spectacularly weird shadow. Enter the fringe fact curse tablets. These weren't just angry letters. They were spells, typically inscribed on thin sheets of lead and buried in graves or thrown into sacred wells. They implored the gods or dead people to mess with someone's love life. Strike Publius with longing, one might say, until he cannot eat or sleep unless he sees my face. That's not a Valentine. That's emotional warfare. Some of these tablets even included detailed instructions for ghosts. including directions like go to his bedroom or haunt him at dinner. And yes, some were quite explicit Roman jealousy didn't pull punches. Historians still argue whether these were true spiritual appeals or just passive-aggressive outlets with better penmanship than modern bathroom stalls. Then there's the ritual of hand fasting, where couples would literally join right hands dextrarum iunctio before witnesses, marking the moment as binding. The term giving one's hand in marriage isn't metaphorical here. It's a legally symbolic clasp. Think of it as a romantic handshake with lifelong consequences, and lest you think love in Rome was all lead tablets and legal scrolls. Remember, Roman poets were the original heartbreak bloggers. Ovid, Propertius, Catullus, they wept, wailed, and overshared in verse about exes, crushes, and ghostings long before Twitter existed. One even cursed his former lover's new boyfriend with the hope that his chariot turns over and crushes him. Charming. So, as the aqueduct hums in the distance and moonlight glints off a freshly carved contract tablet, you realize in Rome, love was measured not just in heartbeats, but in clauses, witnesses, and a goddess who accepted dolls as payment. You duck now behind a columned training yard, where the ground is hard, the diets are harsher, and love looks suspiciously like kidnapping. Welcome to Sparta, where romance is subtle, secretive, and often disguised as a military tactic. You would never think a first date would involve shaving someone's head and sneaking around at night. But that's how the Spartans said, "I like you." Unlike their Greek neighbors, Spartans didn't do flowery poetry or public affection. They did discipline, efficiency, and very strange family-building rituals. The mainstream fact, Spartan marriages were arranged but carried out with an air of espionage. The bride, usually much older than her Athenian counterpart, was abducted in a ceremonial snatching. And no, not against her will. It was staged, like a surprise elopement, but with less romance and more combat boots. Once abducted, the bride had her head shaved and was dressed in a man's tunic and sandals. The goal was to make her look, well, boyish. The groom would then visit her in secret, usually at night, sometimes sneaking away from his military barracks like a teenager past curfew. They met only in the shadows. It was like living inside a romantic subplot directed by a drill sergeant. Historians still argue whether this gender-blurring ritual was symbolic, practical, or just deeply confusing for everyone involved. Was it meant to gradually shift a man's affections from his male companions to his new wife? Or simply a test of stealth and patience before starting a family? We're still guessing. Either way, it gave new meaning to the phrase undercover lover. Now, you might wonder, what about dating? Surely even Spartans flirted. The answer kind of, courtship happened under the radar, encouraged by family or state elders. A man was expected to admire strength, discipline, and health over softness or sweetness. You don't bring roses to a knife fight. Instead, you bring evidence of physical fitness, virtue, and the ability to produce robust little warrior citizens. Fringe fact in some accounts, It was actually customary for women to cut their hair short even after marriage and to maintain the boyish look for a time. Love in Sparta wasn't about beauty. It was about breeding strength. You weren't seeking a soulmate. You were building a battle buddy. And here's the kicker, even after marriage, men often continued to live in communal barracks with fellow soldiers, only visiting their wives on the sly. Full domestic life didn't begin until they were well into adulthood, sometimes not until their 30s. Until then, you saw your spouse in glimpses, under moonlight, like a cross between Romeo and a very tired marathon runner. Still, Spartan women weren't shrinking violets. They had unusual freedom for the time owning property, running households, and even receiving education. If you were a Spartan woman, you could give a man as much sarcasm as support. And if he didn't like it, he probably wasn't strong enough for you anyway. So as you lie now in a quiet field, lit by the pale moon, listening to the distant sound of bronze clashing, you realize in Sparta, love was patient, stealthy, and shaved its head. Now, you press through a dense jungle clearing where the scent of flowers mixes with roasted cacao, and the sound of flutes drifts on the breeze. You've landed among the pre-Columbian Maya, where love isn't just a flutter in the chest, it's a cosmic alignment. Here, romance is overseen by gods, managed by astrologers, and performed with more ceremony than a royal coronation. You would never think your relationship status could depend on the stars literally agreeing to it. But yes, astrology wasn't just for zodiac apps. In this world, love has a schedule. The mainstream fact is that Maya marriages were arranged based on astrology, lineage, and economics. The village matchmaker, or Alatanzahab, consulted a young person's birth date, often recorded in the sacred 260-day calendar, to determine compatibility. If your stars didn't line up, no amount of chocolate gifts or puppy dog eyes would fix it. Your grandmother, your priest, and possibly your deceased ancestors would all veto the match before your crush even noticed you. And yet, despite all the celestial gatekeeping, there were rituals, sweet, strange ones. Chocolate, for example, wasn't just dessert, it was romantic currency. A young man might send a cup of hot cacao to the girl he fancied. If she drank it, she was open to a proposal. If she poured it out or gave it to a dog, ouch. Fringe tidbit. The Maya believed in soul companions known as Weob, spiritual doubles tied to each person's essence. Some lovers performed joint rituals to keep their Weobi aligned, believing that illness or discord in the spirit double could ruin their relationship. You're not just dating someone's personality, you're dating their cosmic shadow dog too. And if you thought weddings today were intense, imagine this. Before the ceremony, the bride had to remain in a smoke-filled sweat lodge to purify her body. Think spiritual sauna, but with more chanting and less cucumber water. The groom, meanwhile, participated in fasting and sometimes bloodletting because nothing says eternal love like poking yourself with a stingray spine. Historians still argue whether love played much of a role in these unions, or if affection was expected to blossom after the ceremony. Some records suggest young people had input. Others imply they were simply informed by a matchmaker who said, "Congratulations, you're marrying Tepu. He has a nice hut and a solid milpa yield." But once married, the couple wasn't thrown into the deep end. Elders guided them, providing instruction on everything from household chores to emotional harmony. Marriage wasn't a finish line. It was a training program. You worked together. You shared responsibilities. And you tried not to offend any deities along the way. Love, in this world, was practical and mystical. It required cosmic approval, social agreement, and at least 2 cacao beans worth of charm. And beneath it all pulsed the quiet belief that when 2 people align correctly, not just on earth, but in the heavens, they bring balance to the universe. So now, as jungle insects sing their lullaby, and the stars overhead whisper in patterns older than language, you realize in the Mayan world, love wasn't blind. It was divinely scheduled. You sit now beside a flickering torch in the misty forests of northern Europe, where antlers decorate altars, and courtship sometimes involves a battle cry. You've entered the world of the ancient Celts, where love rituals walk the line between folklore and festival chaos. You would never think a legal divorce could happen just by walking in opposite directions in front of witnesses, but for the Celts, that was actually a thing. Here, romantic customs are stitched together from oral legend, poetic fragments, and the occasional, suspiciously biased Roman historian. The mainstream fact is that Celtic society, especially in Ireland and parts of Gaul, allowed for trial marriages. A couple could be joined for a year and a day to test compatibility, sort of like a magical prenup with livestock and mead instead of lawyers and spreadsheets. If the trial went poorly, they could part ways without scandal. Just a symbolic gesture. Walk away from each other in a public setting, and boom, single again. Eat your heart out. Reality dating shows. But Celtic love rituals weren't all test runs and rustic annulments. Beltane, the great fire festival held on May 1st, was one of the year's high points for romantic entanglements. Fires were lit across the hills. Couples leapt through the flames, yes, together to seal bonds, increase fertility, or just impress their crush with a little fireproof flair. Fringe detail in some regions. Newly formed couples could spend the night together without judgment, wrapped in blankets under the stars while druids supervised like mystical chaperones. And the matchmaking wasn't left entirely to fate. Druids and bards, those charismatic walking encyclopedias, often played Cupid with a flair for riddles and omens. They might suggest a match based on dreams, star signs, or whether two people had the same spirit animal, likely a very judgmental raven. Now, you might think this all sounds weirdly progressive, and in some ways, yes. Celtic women could own land, divorce their husbands, and even lead armies. Depending on the tribe, marriage could be polygamous, monogamous, or somewhere in between, depending on rank and local law. Historians still argue whether Celtic love culture was truly egalitarian or just creatively flexible. Either way, it had more romantic formats than a streaming service menu. Want to hear something even weirder? There's folklore of love spells involving apples buried in crossroads, honeyed milk poured over graves, and even love charms made of hair braided with silver thread. You weren't just hoping to attract someone, you were building an enchanted mixtape with herbs and weather reports. And yet, despite all this ritual chaos, affection was often spoken plainly. Irish and Welsh epics are filled with poetic love, declarations that, though surrounded by battles and curses, still manage to be heartbreakingly tender. One warrior says of his beloved, "Her voice is sweeter than the harp. Her cheek is the color of foxglove." You don't need a spell to know that's love. So as the Beltane fires die down and the mist rolls in over mossy stones, you realize for the Celts, love wasn't a contract. It was a festival, a trial, and sometimes a torchlit leap into the unknown. You shuffle now into a starlit savanna clearing, where drums throb like a heartbeat and voices rise in rhythmic chants. You're in pre-colonial sub-Saharan Africa, among cultures so diverse that love rituals come in every flavor, from serenades to simulated kidnappings. You would never think proposing marriage could involve literally stealing the bride with the help of your friends and a goat. But for some tribes, that was just the warm-up act. Among the many traditions, one mainstream fact stands out. Marriage in many African societies was less about the couple and more about the joining of two lineages. In places like the Zulu and the Yoruba kingdoms, romantic love was a bonus, not a requirement. What mattered was bride wealth, a carefully negotiated exchange of goods, cattle, or valuables offered by the groom's family. Not as a purchase, but as a symbolic bond of respect. You weren't buying a wife, you were building a permanent, extended WhatsApp group made of elders. But here's the twist. While elders hashed out the cattle math, the younger crowd often had their own secret love games. One fringe tidbit from the Fulani people of West Africa, the Gariwal Festival. It's a kind of male beauty contest where men dress up in elaborate makeup, sing hypnotic songs, and roll their eyes literally as a form of flirtation. Women watch from the sidelines and choose their favorites. No swiping required, just eyeliner, confidence, and the ability to look attractive while crossing your eyes on purpose. Meanwhile, the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania had a custom where men showed interest by spitting on the hand of a potential bride. That's right, not flowers, not poetry, saliva, apparently. It was seen as a blessing, although historians still argue whether the women genuinely appreciated this or just learned to tolerate romantic expectoration. Then there's the wife-stealing mock ritual, performed in some Nilotic communities. It wasn't real theft, more like ceremonial roleplay. Friends of the groom would abduct the bride in a staged scene often met with mock resistance, and then escort her to her new home amid singing and laughter. Think bridal shower meets amateur theater, with extra yelling and goats. It symbolized the separation from her family and her entry into a new social world. Love magic also had a place, of course. In some regions, women created herbal brews or love amulets, often involving local plants believed to increase attraction or ensure fidelity. Men, too, wore charms to guard against rival suitors or bad luck marriages. And if all else failed, you could always consult a village diviner, who might suggest ancestral offerings, chicken bones, or just trying not to be annoying. Historians still argue whether these rituals were rooted in genuine romantic ideals or if they evolved purely to preserve order in family units. But either way, they served their purpose, binding hearts, families, and whole villages into a rhythm as steady as a drumbeat. So now, as the fire crackles low and the chants echo into the dark, you realize here, love isn't whispered under the moon. It's sung, danced, negotiated, and sometimes cross-eyed. You settle now into the soft golden dust of an ancient Babylonian courtyard. The air thick with jasmine and bureaucracy. Yes, bureaucracy. Because love here, like everything else in Mesopotamia, is recorded on a clay tablet in cuneiform, witnessed by elders, and filed with the gods for quality assurance. You would never think romance could come with a receipt and return policy. But here in Babylon, even your feelings wear a seal. The mainstream fact is this: Babylonian marriages were legally binding. Contract-based affairs. Fathers negotiated, scribes recorded, and priests blessed the transaction. But buried within the stone-cold ledgers of human bonding were customs that veered into a frankly bizarre. One such oddity, the so-called sacred marriage ritual. During major festivals, a king might symbolically marry a high priestess representing the goddess Inanna. Their union was, well, dramatic. The entire city watched as love and fertility were ceremonially reenacted, possibly even acted out for real. Historians still argue whether the ritual involved an actual intimate act or was purely symbolic. Either way, awkward. But in more day-to-day romance, Babylon had another eyebrow-raiser: love auctions, in some accounts most famously described by Herodotus. Though heavily debated, young women were once gathered in the town square and auctioned off for marriage. The most beautiful were bid on first. Their value used to fund the dowries of less conventionally attractive girls. It was the world's least romantic fundraiser. Picture a romantic comedy where the meet-cute happens on a bidding platform, and everyone's broke. Still, not all was transactional. Love spells were deeply woven into the culture. Clay amulets and written charms promised to stir affection, ward off rivals, or keep a straying husband in check. One fringe example: A preserved Babylonian incantation reads, "May his mind be turned. May his heart be bound to me like a rope of wool." Forget texting back. You want loyalty, just call on a supernatural lasso. And then there was the infamous Lipit Ishtar law code, a lesser-known sibling to Hammurabi's set of rules that laid out scenarios for marriage and infidelity in chilling detail. Adultery by a married woman could result in drowning. Adultery by a man, well, if he was caught with another man's wife. The husband had options, including legal revenge or public humiliation. Justice wasn't just blind, it was soaking wet and judgmental. But even amid these rigid laws, there were moments of tenderness. Love letters written in cuneiform, pressed gently into clay, still survive. One young man writes to his beloved, "I dreamt of you. My heart is not calm when you are not near." And just like that, beneath all the rules and rituals, you glimpse something fragile, ancient, human. So now, as Babylon's sacred fires flicker out and the clay cools beneath your hands, your eyelids grow heavier. You've wandered through whispers, spells, cross-eyed dances, and legally binding fruit tosses. Love, it turns out, is never just one thing. It is ritual and rebellion, contract and chaos, fire and form. Let the sound of distant flutes cradle you now. Let the stars above the ziggurat dim gently in your mind. The world has spun through thousands of years of awkward courtship and questionable matchmaking. And still, the heart tries, even when the rules are weird. Sleep well, traveler of strange romances.